So I'm going to read Mark 10, 31 to 50. And if there are any words or phrases that stand out at you or strike out at you, do make a note of them. They were now on the way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. "Listen," he said. "We're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days he will rise again." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do us a favour." "What's your request?" he asked. They replied, "When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honour next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must be baptized with?" "Oh yes," they replied, "we are able." Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or on my left. God has pre-prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. And so Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And I think this is a key passage. There are some really interesting points, and we'll explore them now. So this is the 3rd time now that Jesus talks to his disciples about his death and resurrection. He did so previously in 8:31 to 32 and 9:30 to 37. In 9:30 to 37, Jesus too told his disciples about his impending death. Then the disciples discussed who was the greatest among them. And here we find John and James telling Jesus that they want status and glory alongside him. Jesus is talking to them about giving his all, and the disciples respond by talking about what they want. We see through Jesus' repetition of details surrounding his death and his response to the disciples' greedy ambition that the disciples still don't comprehend. They miss the point. They don't grasp the bigger picture. The disciples are following Jesus, but they are falling behind. Jesus wants the disciples to stop thinking selfishly about their own status, their power and prestige, and instead start to understand why Jesus is focused on his death and what it means. He needs and wants them to see that yes, he is the Messiah and that he will die. Why? And that he will rise again in victory. It was also important that they understood for the sake of others' faith and discipleship as well as their own. Perhaps they're not ready yet to grasp the enormity of the coming days. Who would be ready? I can't imagine how you could be ready for something like this. Perhaps they're holding their hands over their ears because they don't want to hear what Jesus is really, really saying. For everything they knew was being turned on its head. The disciples just couldn't get their heads around that the Messiah would have to endure death. They couldn't get their heads around what this could mean for them. As Jews, they most probably also did not understand that Jesus would rise from the dead so presently. They must have been super confused, and it seems that 32 to 34, they were in a haze of a stupor. They were in awe that Jesus was the Messiah. And they didn't seem to have any insight beyond that. But they most likely wanted to believe that something was in it for them too. Surely their association with the Messiah was going to get them somewhere. Their pride played a part in holding them back in their walk with Jesus. On their way to Jerusalem, Jesus and the disciples were followed by others who were filled with fear. And I just wonder, did they have more of an understanding of the severity of the situation, of what was to come? The disciples were more in awe of Jesus, as we mentioned. They were in awe of his status, that he was the Messiah. This was what they held on to. This is what they were focused on. They didn't consider that Jesus' death was part of his vocation. And the significance of his death was not in sight for the disciples. In Isaiah, we see the chapters 40, 55 point to an anointed messianic figure. He suffers and dies for the sins of Israel and the world. This is Yahweh's servant. And Jesus' death was clearly part of his vocation. A question to think about. Do we grasp the enormity of what Jesus did through the cross? Or do we miss the point like the disciples? Perhaps we need to look at this again for ourselves. And question 2. Does our lack of understanding stand in the way of following Jesus? True greatness is found in serving God and one another, not in tussling for power. Not long ago, the disciples discussed together which one of them was the greatest. And Jesus was clear that all are welcome into his presence, that we are equally valued in God's eyes, including the humble and without prestige. Jesus goes to Jerusalem as the Messiah who invites all to come into God's dominion. Despite these teachings, the disciples need reminding constantly about the need for humility and servanthood, even amidst Jesus' prediction for the third time about his death and resurrection. In 10:32 to 45, James and John are focused on worldly glory. They want to sit either side when Jesus is king. But they don't understand Jesus is turning what the world says is successful and glorious upside down. It's about righting things. In this passage, we see the words, to give his life as a ransom for many, which comes just right at the end there. It stays with us. The servant song. It makes the point that the kingdom of God turns worldly power and glory upside down and challenges human systems. This is what Jesus wants the disciples to understand, and he wants us to understand it too. You know, it wasn't about getting through a bad patch and then onto happier days. This was so much more than that. Mark knows what it means to sit at Jesus' left and right at his enthronement in 1527. But James and John, they don't want the struggle involved with God-shaped glory, which is so very different to worldly glory. Jesus' glory involves a giving over, a sacrifice. Jesus totally redefines power and embodies it in his death, a redemptive one. 10:35-45. Jesus' suffering and death are the prophesied victory of the divine warrior. The idea that Jesus goes to Jerusalem to die and not heading up a military campaign as a militarized warrior is totally lost on the disciples. And I can understand why. This is completely beyond their experience, their knowledge of how things work. And they're still yet to catch up. They're still yet to catch up and understand the significance of what Jesus is doing, the significance of his death. And actually there is so much more than worldly power and glory. Like the rich young ruler, they are not ready to let go of their idea of treasure and power. They are not ready for the cup of sacrifice. The disciples then currently don't seek God's kingdom but an earthly one. They want much of the same of the old age. And today, as we emerge from lockdown, there is an opportunity to create a different kind of community and economy, one that is more in line with the kingdom of God, one that looks to the poor, those knowing injustice. It looks to creation care for the benefit of all. And because God said it is good. What kind of world do we seek? Just a question for you. Is it more in line with God's kingdom or worldly ways? Perhaps this is just something that we need to reflect on and think about, and think about how we live. Tearfund and other organisations are exploring what our communities might look like as we emerge from lockdown, and they invite us into the conversation. So you might want to look at Tearfund resources, for example, Reboot, World Rebooted. If we want to be a part of God's kingdom, then we need to care about what Jesus did for as well. We need to care about what God is doing in our world today. We need to care about his peace, his shalom, restoration, to care about community. The others following Jesus were indignant when they found out what they had asked of Jesus, not because they were annoyed at them for insensitively saying such things to Jesus, but because they wanted in on the glory too. They wanted the honour and the lights as well. And it's uncomfortable, but perhaps we see ourselves reflected in James and John and the other disciples. We too are selfish. The disciples were humans like us. They didn't excel at discipleship. We can see that here. We can see that through the many stories in the Bible. Jesus was constantly having to teach them the same thing, remind them the same thing. And many in the church today seek after power, and they struggle in their discipleship. And Jesus tries to point out true discipleship, which involves at its core humble service. In 10:42-45, Jesus says, "Be great servants to others." Be great servants to others. And maybe that's something that we can reflect on this week. What does servanthood look like? How are we serving those around us, and how can we serve those in our community, those in our church communities, our local communities? How can we reflect God's love, God's hope, God's peace? How can we reflect God in our communities? So Jesus advocates for self-giving, a significant self-giving love and sacrifice that is connected to victory. And so what does this mean for us as we follow Jesus, as we seek to follow him? It means that we try to turn the world's values and power systems on their head by giving ourselves to others, by outward looking, not just focusing on ourselves, but looking outwardly to those around us, sacrificing our time and holding money and possessions more loosely. The rich young ruler must sell all, give to the poor and follow Jesus. How does that story that we read and listened to last week, how does that challenge us? How has it challenged you this last week? And here are a few key points for reflection. What does it mean to have a servant for a Lord? How do we define greatness and how we can attain it? Are we more self-seeking or more community-focused? And Jesus' life turns worldly understanding of greatness and great works on its head, through valuing self-giving sacrifice. Do we hunger for power? Are we tempted to seek higher things? And I'm sure that we do. I'm sure that we actually can see ourselves in the disciples quite strongly. And I think if we can just give that to God this week, give that to God this week and ask him to move in it. To help us reorientate our heart and minds. And even many ministers dream of a big church presidency. Even ministers struggle with discipleship. And a key quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love." And in 10:46-52, we read the story about the blind man. The blind man, he sees and follows Jesus, is Mark's model of true discipleship. The desire to understand brings us closer to Jesus. Through Jesus, our eyes can be opened. Through Jesus, we can see more clearly. So let us see, let us understand and desire to follow Jesus. And I'd just like to finish with a question. So what do you want Jesus to do for you?